Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you this morning. There's a great scene from our gospel today. This moment of intense clarity to the eyes of Peter, James, and John. For just the briefest of moments, they get to see Jesus in all of his glory. They get to see the truth of who Jesus is as the Son of God. This moment of great clarity is not the reason for their faith in Jesus. It is the result of their faith in Jesus. This moment in their lives in which they see Jesus for who he truly is not the thing that makes them believe in him. Instead, it is the product of the fact that they have already begun to believe in him. And this is so important. Before they climb this Mount Tabor, Jesus has looked at his apostles and he's asked them, "Who am I? You've seen some of the amazing things I've done. You've heard some of the incredible things I have taught. What's your conclusion about me?" And Peter, speaking on behalf of the other 12, says, "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ." This declaration of faith about who Jesus is, even before Peter has clearly seen what it fully means, opens them up to be able to take in this great scene of Jesus in all of his glory on the mountain. This moment of intense clarity. I bring this up, that it was their faith that was the result. That this scene was the result of their faith, not the reason for it. Because if the stakes are so high, that we know and that we love God, why does it seem that so often God remains so hidden? If it is so important that I not only know of God's existence and that I know that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, why, beyond any shadow of a doubt, doesn't God just make it obviously clear to each and every one of us? Why can't we also just have this Mount Tabor experience that then opens us up to just knowing without any further questions, any further doubts, that Jesus is God? Why did God just hang a banner in the sky that says, "I'm here," and then we no longer had any questions? A few weeks ago, my nephew Henry, he's in preschool, asked his dad a pretty profound theological question. They were outside, and he asked his dad, my brother Luke, "Dad, which cloud does Jesus live in again?" Luke tried to answer this question the best he could for a few minutes until Henry finally cut him off and just said, "Oh, okay, Dad, I get it. Jesus lives in the sun." Not quite. But why isn't it so abundantly clear to us? These last 3 years when I was teaching high school in Davenport, towards the beginning of each semester in the fall, we would have a little practice of what does it mean to have faith? And why is it at times difficult to have faith? And so we would do this thing called a four-corner debate. I would present them with a prompt that they would have to respond to, and then they would go to the corresponding corner in the room, and we would hash it out. And the first prompt was this: it is harder to have faith in Jesus in 2025 than it would have been 2,000 years ago. And every time we would have this debate, there would be a lot of good reasons why people would agree with that. Yeah, it is harder to have faith today than it would have been 2,000 years ago. And why? Well, one of the biggest reasons was, if I lived 2,000 years ago, I could have seen Jesus. And if I could have seen Jesus, well then, yeah, I would have easily been able to believe in him. So why does God not give us that ability? Why does it seem like we carry a burden of faith? There's a lot of different answers we could give to that question. But perhaps the one I want us to hone in on today is that God is inviting each of us into a relationship with Him. And for a relationship to be true, it can't be forced. That if God just was always so imminently making Himself known to us in a way that we could not deny, then we could never actually freely choose Him. And if we could not freely choose Him, then we could not love Him. We know this in all of our relationships. This is why every time a couple gets married here, the very first question they're asked is, have you come here freely, wholeheartedly, and without coercion? Because without the ability to freely choose, we cannot love. And what God wants us is not just to force us into knowing and loving Him. He wants us to choose knowing and loving Him. And it's this choice that opens us up to begin to see things on a larger scale. It opens us up to begin to not just see things down here below with human eyes, but with the eyes of faith. And it's this relationship that we see God inviting Abraham into in our first reading today. You'll remember at this point in his life, Abraham's an old guy, and he has no kids. 3 years before this interaction with God, God promised Abraham descendants. He was 75 at the time. Abraham, looking at his life through his own eyes, was, not happening, God. 3 years down the road, nothing still has happened. Abraham still has no descendants. And at this point, Abraham very well could have said, God, I cannot believe what you are promising me, just based on what I see. But then again today, God promises him many descendants. Abraham, look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. So many will your descendants be. And then immediately we hear that Abraham put his faith in the Lord. Has God just given Abraham this great vision that beyond a shadow of a doubt was a source of promise? Count the stars if you can. Is it this vision, this proof, that has led Abraham to put his faith in God? I mean, how many stars did Abraham count that allowed him to trust and believe God? 0. I don't think Abraham counted a single star. And the reason for that, everybody, is that when God invites Abraham to count the stars, and then Abraham puts his faith in God, it's daytime. And you can't see any stars in daytime. I don't know if you caught this. I only caught it yesterday. When God invites Abraham to look at the sky and count the stars, the sun is still shining. It's not until later in the reading that we hear that the sun began to set. And then the sun did set and it was completely dark. And you can't see stars in the daylight, but how many stars are there even though we can't see them? All 200 billion trillion of them. Abraham put his faith in God not based on what he could see, but based on the word of God that he had come to hear and then trust. And this opened Abraham up to a relationship that allowed him to see beyond what was purely humanly visible. It allowed Abraham to see that faith in God is not based on the time or our season. Faith in God is not based on our place, like where we're at. And faith in God is not based on our conditions. To see the stars with our human eyes is dependent on all of those things. The time of day, whether it's cloudy or clear, and whether you're in the middle of a city or out in the country. But faith allows us to see through any and all of those conditions. And it opens us up to have trust in God, even when we can't see him. There was a priest, Father Walter Chisholm. He was a Jesuit missionary from the United States that in the mid-20th century felt called by God to become a missionary to the Soviet Union. He had this deep desire to go to Russia and bring the faith there. And it was a calling that he was so convinced that God had spoken so clearly to him. And the day finally came. While he was on this train with basically Polish prisoners, headed into the Soviet Union. And he finally gets there. He sees Russia, and his heart leaps for joy because at last he's in this place that he's felt so convicted that God was calling him to. He was going to preach the gospel to them. He was going to bring the sacraments to them. And then he starts to live his life in the Soviet Union. And this thing that was so clear, this thing he was so convinced of, starts to seem so confused. No one wants to hear him preach. Everyone is afraid to participate in any of the sacraments he's trying to secretly, clandestinely share with them. And he starts to doubt that moment of clarity that led him there in the first place. And he thinks, I just need to go. I need to leave. I need to get back to Poland. This was all just a fabrication in my mind. I was wrong. But then he had this experience in prayer. He said, and he wrote this in his book, He Leadeth Me, which I recommend you read. It's such a great story. He said, I was given this grace to begin to see my circumstances not from my own point of view, but from the point of view of God. I began to see that perhaps God had reasons that my own limited human eyes could not presently see. What is that? That's faith. That's faith that goes beyond our circumstances and conditions and starts to see the ways in which God is acting, starts to see the things that God has done and then God will do, not dependent on what we can immediately see. This is what Abraham was being invited into today. And this was the result of the faith that Peter and the other apostles had began to put into Jesus. Because right after they leave this mountain of clarity, they're going to be headed to a mountain of confusion. They will leave Mount Tabor and from there go immediately to Mount Calvary. And this great clarity of Jesus in his glory is going to transition to Jesus in agony. And it's going to be faith, not sight, that allows them to see God still working despite these difficult conditions. It's going to be faith, not sight, that allows them to see that the God of Mount Tabor is also the God on Mount Calvary. Faith, not sight, that allows them to see that the God of life is also the God in death. Faith, not sight, that allows them to see the God in light is also God in darkness. That the God in joy is also the God in sorrow. That the God in clarity is also the God in confusion. This is the relationship that God is inviting each and every one of us to regain over this season of Lent. And so wherever you are at, and having your eyes with faith attuned to see God, in the words of Peter, it is good that we are here. Because each and every Sunday we freely choose to come to this place. And each and every Sunday we approach this altar where the hidden God, for just a moment, begins to become visible to us. That the God who is so far above us starts to come so close to us in a way that we can little by little begin to see, taste, and understand in this Eucharist. So may this Eucharist for each of us this morning be a place where we encounter the Lord, who is with us at all times, independent of circumstances, independent of conditions, independent of the season of life you find yourself in, independent of all of it, that we might know the goodness of God and recognize that it is good that we are